Her stepfather signed her away for a team of mules and a barrel of iron nails. The document was still on my table when she arrived. 3 lines of writing, a notary stamp from the county seat, and her stepfather's name scratched at the bottom in the penmanship of a man who'd never been careful about anything in his life. I hadn't asked for the paper. He'd pressed it into my hand at the gate like a man settling a debt he was embarrassed about, said, "She's yours to do with," and didn't look back at the wagon before he turned his horse east. I stood there in my own yard, holding a deed to a human being. I want to be straight about something before I say anything else. I was 53 years old that spring, which is old enough to have watched a lot of things go wrong in this world, and I had never once in my life believed a man could sign his name to another person. I'd spent 11 years tracking for the Army out of Fort Reno, which means I had seen the other side of that idea, what it does, what it leaves behind, what the land looks like after that thinking runs its course. So I stood there in my yard with that paper, and the wagon was coming up the last 100 yards of my road, and I already knew I was going to need to handle this carefully. Her name was Cora. Not a name he gave her. She told me later her mother had named her before she died, and that the man who'd sold her had called her the girl for 4 years like a man who owns a piece of equipment he hasn't gotten around to naming. She was 22. She had her mother's Bible in a flour sack, a change of clothes, and a look on her face when the wagon stopped that I have spent a long time trying to find words for. Not afraid, exactly. She'd already gone past afraid. It was more like a person who has decided to stop expecting anything, and is waiting to find out what kind of nothing this particular nothing will turn out to be. I helped her down from the wagon. I shook the driver's hand and paid him the $1 he was owed for the trip, which he took quickly, like a man who wants to be somewhere else. I waited until his rig was back down my road, and turning south before I said anything to her. I said, "I'm going to burn that paper." She didn't say anything. She looked at me the way you look at a man when you've learned that what men say and what men do are 2 different countries with a mountain range between them. I said, "I mean what I said. I don't own anybody. You can stay if you want work and a safe place. You can go if you want to go. There's a town called Mercer 8 miles east, and I'll drive you there and give you enough money to get settled if that's your preference. You don't owe me an answer right now." She looked at the house, she looked at the barn. She looked at the 6 horses in the pasture and the smoke coming off the chimney and the wood stacked under the lean-to, neat and head high. Then she looked at me, not the way she'd looked at me before. Something was different in it, some small adjustment behind the eyes, like a person who has just recalculated something. She said, "I'm a decent cook and I can mend harness. I know horses." I said that was more than I'd been managing on my own, and showed her where things were. "My name is Elias Cord. I want you to know that because this story is mine, and I don't want to tell it like I'm standing outside it looking in. I had come to that piece of land in the Cimarron country 7 years before, after I left the Army, and decided I was done with work that required me to know which direction a man had bled. The ranch was 340 acres, a good creek, timber on the north ridge, winter grass that came back reliable every year. I had 23 horses at peak. I bred them sound and sold them honest and kept a reputation for both, which in that part of Oklahoma territory in those years was worth more than a brand. I had no wife. I had been married once, years earlier, to a woman named Ruth, and she had died of fever when we were both still young enough that the grief had nowhere to go and just became part of the architecture of who I was. I wasn't broken by it. I want to be clear about that too. I had rebuilt myself into something functional, even solid. But there is a difference between a man who is whole and a man who has learned to run well on fewer parts, and I knew which one I was. I had a Comanche woman named Tess Whitehorse who came twice a week to cook and clean, and she was a good woman and a straight dealer, and we had an easy understanding. I had a hired man named Dolph who was 60 and slow, but knew horses the way some men know whiskey, which is to say with devotion and consequence. I had 2 border collies named Frank and Edith who managed the property lines better than any fence I'd built. And now I had Cora. The first week she stayed in the spare room with the door shut and came out only for meals, and I left her alone. That is a kind of patience I have always understood, the patience of an animal that has been mishandled and needs time to determine that the new space does not contain the old danger. I have gentled enough horses to know that you do not demonstrate trustworthiness by talking about it. You demonstrate it by doing nothing alarming repeatedly, until the animal's body begins to believe what its mind is slowly conceding. On the 4th morning she came out before I was done with the horses and stood at the paddock fence and watched me work a 3-year-old gray that had been giving me trouble on the right lead. She didn't say anything for maybe 20 minutes, just watched. Then she said, "You're asking him before you're telling him." I said that was correct. She said, "My mother's people were horse people. She talked about it before she got sick." I said I'd heard the Cheyenne had an understanding with horses that went back further than any method I'd ever been taught. She looked at the gray for a while and then she said, "What's his name?" I said I hadn't named him yet, which was true. I named horses when I understood them, which sometimes took time. She watched him for another minute. She said, "Cedar. He moves like he's got roots and is surprised by them." I looked at the gray. He was doing a thing with his near hind that I had noticed, a half-second of planted weight before the push. I said that was a good name, and he would answer to it by summer. She almost smiled, not quite, but almost. Her stepfather's name was Aldous Prewitt, and before I go further I should tell you what I learned about him because it matters to what comes later. He had come into the territory 4 years prior from somewhere in Missouri, trailing debts, and a story about a farm that burned and a wife who died of it. The wife was Cora's mother. The farm story was mostly true, though what burned it was less an accident than a winter of poor decisions and unpaid whiskeys. Cora had been 17 when her mother died, which left her alone with a man who had no particular cruelty in him, but also no particular decency, which is its own kind of hard to live inside. He had worked a claim east of Mercer for a year, given up on it, drifted south, taken a job as a freighter's second hand. The mules and the nails he'd traded her for, I found out later, were for a freighting contract he'd gotten through a man named Calhoun who ran supply lines to 3 army posts. It was a good contract. She had been in the way of it, a cost he hadn't budgeted, a mouth and a presence and a legal complication if he just left her. So he had turned her into an asset. I burned the paper the first evening, fed it to the cook stove right in front of her, which was deliberate, watched it go orange and black and curl and drop into ash. She watched it too. Neither of us said anything about what it meant. We just watched it burn. The trouble started in late May, which is about 6 weeks after she arrived. I had gone to Mercer for supplies and came back to find a man I didn't know sitting on the fence rail of my south paddock, watching the horses. He had the look of a man who was trying to appear casual about something he was not casual about. Big across the shoulders, sun-dark, with a pistol worn high on his left hip the way men wear them when they want it to look like an afterthought. He said his name was Vickers. He said he was Aldous Prewitt's business associate, and he had come about a contract matter. I got down off the wagon, and I didn't invite him inside. He said Prewitt had been thinking it over, and believed the trade had been unfair. That the girl had value he'd undersold, and he was prepared to take a cash settlement to make it right, or else he was prepared to take the girl back. I looked at him for a while. He was trying to read me and finding it slow going, which was intentional. I said, "There's nothing to settle." He said Prewitt thought different. I said, "Prewitt signed a document under a false legal premise, because no legal authority in this territory, this country, or any country I'm aware of allows one man to transfer another person's life to a third party. The paper he wrote means nothing. It never did. The woman is a free person, and she is free to be here or free to go anywhere she likes, and that has been true since before Pruitt wrote his name on anything. I'd suggest you carry that back to him." Vickers looked at the house. The window was there, I didn't look at it. He said, "She's here then." I said, "Good day, Mr. Vickers." He got off the fence and he left, but he left slow. The way a man leaves when he wants you to know he's deciding to leave rather than being made to. I told Cora that evening. I did not soften it. She was at the stove and she listened without turning around, and when I was done, she set the pan down and stood still for a moment. She said, "How much trouble is this going to make you?" I said, "Some, maybe more than some." She turned around. She said, "I can go to Mercer. You could say I left." I said, "I'm not going to do that." She looked at me. Again that recalculation behind the eyes, except this time it settled into something steadier. She said, "Why not? You don't owe me anything." And this is the part that took me a moment, because it's the kind of question that sounds like it's asking about obligation when it's actually asking about something else. About what kind of man you are when nobody's forcing you to be one kind or the other. I said, "Because you haven't done anything wrong, and because a man who moves people out of his way when they become inconvenient is a kind of man I don't want to be. You can go if you want to go. I'm just telling you that if you stay, I'll handle what comes." She picked up the pan again. After a minute she said, "Dolph told me you were the man the whole valley called first when something needed doing right." I said Dolph talked too much. She almost smiled again. This time it was closer. 2 weeks passed. The gray horse was answering to Cedar. Cora had taken over the morning feeding without being asked, and did it with a quiet efficiency that the horses responded to, that attentiveness some people have where an animal just decides you're all right. Frank and Edith, who were ordinarily suspicious of newcomers, had transferred their allegiances in a way that Dolph found personally offensive. She was, as she'd said, a good cook, better than good. She made a Cheyenne corn bread from a recipe she kept in her head, her mother's, and the first time she put it on the table I ate 3 portions and Dolph ate 4, and she watched us with an expression that was close to pleasure. She mended harness. She helped recaulk the hay barn roof. She learned the horses by name within the first week, all 21 of them, including the 3 that were particular about who handled them. And she had a way of moving through the paddock that was so undemanding that the herd didn't shift when she passed through it, which is the best thing you can say about a person in a horse pasture. I found myself watching her work, not for any complicated reason, or maybe for a reason I wasn't ready to name yet. Mostly I was watching the way a man watches something that is being done well, which is its own kind of pleasure. She was precise. She was patient. She wasted nothing and complained about nothing and asked questions that showed she was thinking about things at an angle to what was obvious. And she was funny, in a dry, quiet way that snuck up on you. Dolph had said something self-important about the best method for splitting winter wood, and she had listened to his whole speech, and then said without looking up from the harness she was stitching, "My mother always said an expert is just a man who ran out of people to correct." And the way Dolph looked at her afterward was the look of a man who has been accurately described. I laughed at that, really laughed, which surprised me. I hadn't done much of it in a while. The second time Vickers came, he brought 2 men with him. They came at dusk, which was calculated. I had seen the dust on the south road, and I had my rifle in my hand before they were through the gate. I told Cora to stay inside. She didn't argue. Vickers got down and left his men on their horses. He said Pruitt had taken legal advice, which I doubted, and that there were grounds for recovery of property. He used that word, property. I said, "Last time I'll tell you, there's no legal ground in this territory or any other for what you're describing. You want to try it in a court, go find one. The territorial judge comes through Mercer first Tuesday of every month. I'll be there." Vickers said the judge was a long time coming, and they were here now. I let that sit a moment. I said, "You see that barn?" He looked at it. I said, "I built it with 12 men over 4 days in the summer of '84. Every man who helped build it has been to my table, and most of their boys have been on my horses. The man who owns the mercantile in Mercer has bought from me for 6 years. The county sheriff rides a horse I sold him 2 seasons back. I have been in this valley a long time, and I have conducted myself one way, and that way has built something. You come onto my land one more time with men, and you will find out what 7 years of straight dealing looks like when it decides to push back. You clear on that?" Vickers looked at me for a long time. He said, "This ain't finished." I said, "Yes, it is." They left, the 3 of them, back through the gate, and this time the slow leaving felt different. It felt like a man recalculating. I stood in the yard until their dust was gone. Then I went inside and I sat down at the table, and I was aware, in the way you get aware of things when the blood is still moving fast, that my hands were steady. That surprised me a little. At 53, I had thought the part of me that went cold under pressure might have softened. It hadn't. Cora came out of the back room. She set a cup of coffee in front of me. She didn't ask what had happened because she'd heard it through the window. She just sat down across from me, and after a minute she said, "Did you mean it about the sheriff?" I said I did. She said, "Are you sure he'll come?" I said, "Tom Hatchett has ridden that roan mare I sold him for 2 seasons and hasn't had a day's trouble with her. He'll come." She wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked at the table. She said quietly, "Nobody has done that before." I said, "Done what?" She said, "Stood for me, out in the open where men could see." I didn't have an answer to that right away. What she said was plain, and it landed plain, and I didn't want to dress it up into something it wasn't or smooth over the weight of it with words. I said, "It's the right thing." She looked up. She said, "A lot of men know what the right thing is, not as many do it." We sat there for a while, just drinking the coffee. Outside, Frank had settled on the porch, and Edith was somewhere in the dark doing rounds. The horses were quiet. The night smelled like rain coming in from the northwest, that particular smell of wet sage on cold air that I had always thought was the best smell this country makes. Tom Hatchett came 2 days later, not because I sent for him. He had heard from the man who ran the livery in Mercer, who had heard from the driver who'd brought Cora out, who had mentioned it in the way men mention things in small towns when they're not sure what to do with what they know. Tom was a careful man and a fair one. He sat at my table and listened to the whole of it without interruption, and then he asked Cora 2 questions directly, speaking to her like a person instead of an exhibit, which I noted. He said, "You're here of your own free will?" She said yes. He said, "You want to stay?" She looked at me for just a half second before she answered. Then she said, "Yes." He said, "That's enough for me." He looked at me. He said, "Pruitt's got a freighting contract, which means he's got reason to stay in the territory, which means I can find him. I'm going to have a conversation with him about what the law says and what it doesn't, and if Vickers sets foot on your land again, you send for me." He drank his coffee and stood and put his hat on. At the door, he looked back at Cora. He said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry you got handed to people who didn't know your worth. That's their failing, not yours." She held herself very still when he said it. I saw it. The way a person goes still when something lands that they were not braced for. He left. Cora sat back down and was quiet for a bit. Then she said, "He means it." I said Tom Hatchett had always meant what he said. She said, "So do you." It wasn't a question. June came and the grass came up, and I put the horses on the south pasture, and Cedar had come into himself in a way I had been hoping for but hadn't been sure about. He had a quality that was hard to describe, a kind of steady willingness, not the restless energy of a young horse that hasn't found its purpose yet, but something settled. Cora had been working him on the ground in the evenings, a quiet, patient method that I recognized as Cheyenne in its patience and its refusal to rush. I asked her one evening how she'd learned it. She said her mother had taught her the language of it before she could ride, that there were things you learned through your body before your mind could put words to them. I said I thought that was true of most things worth knowing. She looked at me sideways. She said, "You're not what I expected." I asked what she'd expected. She thought about it. She said, "A man who'd take what was handed him." I said, "The paper never meant anything." She said, "You keep saying that." I said, "Because I think you're still not quite sure of it." She was quiet for a while. Cedar moved along the fence line, cropping at something in the corner. She was watching him, but I thought she was not really seeing him. She said, "For 4 years I was a problem to be solved, a thing to be managed. He never hit me, if that's what you're wondering. He just looked through me, like I was furniture he hadn't decided what to do with yet." I didn't say anything. There are things that don't need answering, just receiving. She said, "The way you look at people, you look at them like they're there." I said I had found it was generally a good policy. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was close to one. She said, "Dolph said you were the best man with horses in 4 counties. I think he was trying to say something else. I said Dolph had always been an indirect speaker. This time she did laugh, short and real, a sound I hadn't heard from her before. The trouble with Pruitt came to its end in a way that I had not fully anticipated, which is usually how endings come. Tom had gone to find him as he'd promised, and the conversation he'd had apparently been sufficient, because for 3 weeks nothing happened. But the 4th week I came back from a ride to find Pruitt himself at my gate. Not Vickers, Pruitt. He was a thin man, which surprised me. I had built him up in my mind into something larger, the way you do with men who have done harm, but in person he was just thin and weathered and standing at my gate with his hat in his hands, which was not the posture of a man who'd come to threaten anything. He said he'd come to apologize. I looked at him for a long time. He said Hatchet had made certain things plain to him. He said he'd done wrong. He said it the way men say things they believe have to be said, but that they've rehearsed so many times the words have gone a little hollow, and I couldn't tell entirely how much of it was real and how much was the fear of consequence. Maybe some of both. Most apologies are. I said, "She should hear this, not me." He looked at the house. I called for Cora. She came to the door and stood on the porch and looked at him the way she'd looked at me that first day, past afraid, waiting to see what kind of nothing this would be. He said to her that he'd been wrong, that her mother would not have permitted it, that he was sorry. He turned his hat in his hands while he said it, not looking at her, then looked up at the last part. She stood very still on the porch. She said, "I know you were never cruel on purpose, I know that, but knowing something isn't the same as forgiving it." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He said, "I know." He left. We watched him go, neither of us saying anything, and when the road was empty again, Cora sat down on the porch step and put her face in her hands for a moment, not crying or not quite. Just a long breath out, the way a person breathes when something they've been carrying a long time is set down. I sat on the step beside her, not close, just there. After a while she said, "Is it always so unsatisfying when it ends?" I said, "In my experience, yes. The ending rarely feels like the ending feels like in stories." She lifted her face. She looked at the road where he'd gone. She said, "Then what does it feel like in real life?" I said, "Like waking up the next morning and having things to do." She looked at me. Something in her face had changed, or maybe I was seeing it differently now. The stillness that had been in her since the first day, the waiting for nothing stillness, had shifted. There was something behind it now. Not happiness exactly, but an openness. A willingness. She said, "What things?" I said, "Cedar needs working. The hay barn roof's going to need the north end seen to before the rains come heavy. Dolph is going to take 3 hours to split the wood he should do in one. I have a buyer coming from Guthrie on Thursday for the 2 roans." She almost smiled. Then she did smile, fully, for the first time since she'd arrived. It changed her face in a way that I found I had to look away from, not because it was unpleasant but because it wasn't, and I was 53 years old and not a man who moved fast toward anything good, having learned that good things require a careful approach or they startle. She said, "I'd like to be there when the buyer comes for the roans. I know their gates better than Dolph does." I said that seemed sensible. The summer ran out and the fall came in, and I want to tell you about the fall because the fall is where this story actually lives, the part that I return to most, the part that I'll carry to the end of whatever time I've got left. Cedar turned out to be exactly what I'd hoped. I sold him to a rancher near Woodward in September, a man named Beaumont who'd heard about him through the valley and made the trip to see him. The price was fair, the best I'd gotten for a horse that season, and when Beaumont rode him out I watched Cora watch him go, the particular expression of someone who has put something good into the world and is letting it be gone. I said, "You named him right." She said, "He knew who he was." I just said it out loud. We stood at the fence for a while after Beaumont's dust was gone. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "Why did you stay a single man so long, after Ruth?" The name surprised me. I hadn't spoken it to her, which meant she'd heard it from Dolph, which was fine. Dolph talked. I looked out at the empty pasture. I said, "I think I didn't believe I was the kind of man a good woman chose for reasons. I thought if one came along it would be by default, because something else fell through. I wasn't something a woman aimed for." I said it and it came out more plainly than I'd intended, more true. And I felt the way you feel when a thing you've been keeping in your chest for a long time gets into the air. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's wrong." I said, "I know that now." She said, "I mean before right now, that was wrong." I looked at her. She was looking at the pasture still, but there was a color in her face that had not been there before, something underneath the steadiness. She said, "You stood between me and men who came to take me. You burned the paper the first evening. You told me I could go and you meant it, which is the most frightening kind of kindness, the kind with no catch. You look at horses like they have a right to their own nature. You looked at me that way too from the first day." She paused. A woman doesn't fail to notice these things. My heart was doing something that I had not expected from it at 53. I said, "I'm not a young man, Cora." She said, "I didn't ask for a young man." I said, "I'm set in some ways." She said, "Set in the ways that matter." I turned to look at her. She was looking at me now fully, that steady, direct look that I had come to understand as her truest expression. No performance in it, no strategy. Just a woman saying what was true. I said, "I would not want to misread this." She said, "You're not misreading it." The late September light was the color that light gets in that country in the afternoons, a kind of gold that doesn't exist anywhere else, falling at an angle across the fence posts and the dry grass in her face. She reached out and put her hand on my arm, not dramatically. Just laid it there, the way you do when you want someone to know you're there without making a production of it. Her hand was warm through my sleeve. I put my hand over hers. We stood like that at the fence for a while, looking at the empty pasture where Cedar had been, and the hills beyond, and the country going gold in every direction. We married in November, the first Tuesday of the month when Tom Hatchett was in Mercer for the court, and he stood up with us along with Dolph and Tess, and the mercantile man whose name was Albert Crane, who shook my hand after and said he was glad for me and meant it. Cora wore a dress she had made herself from cloth she'd chosen in Mercer, a blue-gray that was close to the color of the hills on a cold morning, and she wore her mother's small silver cross at her throat, and she looked at me during the ceremony with an expression that I will not try to describe because I don't have the language for it, and I suspect no one does. I will only say that it was direct and it was warm, and it was the look of a woman who is making a free choice, who sees what she is choosing and is not confused about it. I had not thought, in the 10 years since Ruth died, that I would stand again in front of a judge and make those promises. I had considered it enough times to stop considering it. And then the thing happened that sometimes happens, that you stop expecting something and that is exactly when it arrives, wearing a flour sack and a face prepared for nothing and choosing, eventually, to be surprised by something better. We are still here, 7 years now past that November. Dolph retired 2 winters ago and we hired a younger man. But Dolph still comes by twice a week, because he cannot stand not being involved. And Cora feeds him every time and pretends to find his opinions on firewood interesting, which is a kindness I could not equal. Frank died of old age the winter before last, which is the way things go. Edith is still working, slower now but faithful as sunrise. We have 41 horses this season, the most I've ever run. Cora manages half the sales because she has an instinct for the moment when a buyer is ready, and I tend to let a silence go too long, and she has been right more often than I have, which I have said out loud on more than one occasion, because I think a man who can't say that kind of thing plainly is a man who doesn't trust his own good fortune. Some evenings we sit on the porch after supper, and the valley goes dark the slow way it goes dark out here. First the color leaving the far hills, and then the near ones and then the yard, and the horses go quiet, and the sky fills up with what it fills up with on nights when there's no moon. She leans against me on those evenings, not performing anything, not making a point, just there the way she always is, warm and steady and present. A few months after we married I came across Aldous Prewitt's paper, the original, not the one I burned. It had been in the lining of Cora's flour sack, folded small, and she had not known it was there. Or maybe she had kept it the way you keep a difficult thing, because putting it away is different from pretending it didn't exist. I showed it to her and asked what she wanted to do with it. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she took it to the stove and fed it in the same way I had fed the first one, and we stood in the kitchen and watched it go the same way, orange and black and curling and ash. And this time she was the one who watched it all the way down to nothing. She closed the stove door. She said, "That's the end of that." And it was. What I know now that I did not know then is that the document never had power because it never had truth. You cannot sign away a person because a person is not a thing to be signed. The paper was always nothing. The only real thing was what happened after it, 2 people in a yard, one holding something worthless, both of them figuring out what came next. What came next was this. Her hand on my arm at the fence. The gold afternoon. 41 horses and a good roof and Dolph's opinions about firewood and Edith still working the fence line in the dark. Her voice in the morning. Her face in the particular light. A man standing in his own yard, finally, with nothing missing. I am glad to have been this man. I did not always know I would get to be.